Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest, Robert Parker. Robert is a lecturer in the Department of History and Philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. His research interests include the two world wars, British prime ministers, and the British monarchy. His book of 2022 is a fictional account of the unexplained World War II flight of Rudolf Hess to Great Britain in what is considered an attempt to perhaps develop a treaty between Germany and England. Thank you for joining me, Robert. First of all, it's a fictional book that you wrote. Everything else you've written, I think, is actually straight history, right? But this is your first attempt at fiction.
Yes, all of my previous books were straightforward history, but I thought I'd try my hand at a novel, and this one involves World War II, and everybody loves to read about Churchill and the Second World War, and it tries to incorporate some of the background that I've experienced.
Yeah, and it's interesting, there's sort of a chess illusion in the title, Churchill's Gambit. So there's sort of a plot beneath the plot that you're implying here, right? But before we get to that, tell us what's going on regarding World War II at this point, because this is actually an event, right? This actually happened. We just don't know why it happened.
This is before the United States entered the war, before the Soviet Russians entered the war, and England was standing alone against Hitler and the Germans.
So Dunkirk has happened at this point?
Dunkirk has happened, but England's back is up against the wall. The Blitzkrieg is on. Germany is bombing England night and day, bombing London. And people in England were looking for a way to obtain an ally. The United States wasn't going to be an ally. We were forced into the war by the Japanese. So perhaps, according to this novel, Churchill could split the alliance between the Soviet Russians and the Germans. And this explores those possibilities.
Well, since you're a historian, let's look at what we know about this, okay? In terms of there being a truce between Germany and England, how likely was that to happen with Churchill as prime minister?
Probably not very likely at all. However, that's what gives the plot of the book a twist. And don't forget, Rudolf Hess, the number 2 German in the Adolf Hitler government, did fly to Great Britain successfully. So there was a conceivability here that perhaps there was something going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, so this is a fact that he did this. And
absolutely.
And you know, from everything we know about this, Germany was just hell-bent on going through with this war, right? So here's the person who's, second in command under Hitler, and he's making this and tell us about this unbelievable trip that he made, that he actually made.
Well, he was interested in flying anyway, Hess was. And he thought that navigationally and in terms of his aeronautic ability, he could fly solo a plane 800 miles from the heart of Germany and successfully land in Great Britain. Now, above and beyond the conceivability of a plot to make an alliance, a peace alliance, it was an amazing piece of flying and navigation on the part of Hess.
So you make him sound like he was an amateur pilot, not an accomplished pilot.
He was an amateur in the sense that he wasn't a warrior pilot. He had fought in World War I, but he fought in the trenches. But he had learned to fly, he loved flying, and he had trained himself to make this journey, this flight. Whether or not it was prompted by Hitler or encouraged by Churchill has always been speculated, but never been proven one way or another.
That's fascinating. I've never heard anyone argue that Hitler or Churchill would have considered any kind of a truce once the war started.
Well, that's the basis of the book that makes what seems to be an inconceivable flight. Why would he do this?
Yet he made that flight.
Right,
he actually
did
made
make
that
the flight, and he flew through the defenses of Germany. He flew through the defenses of Great Britain. He was unable to land. He wanted to. Instead, he flew upside down and bailed out and parachuted safely to the ground.
About 17 miles from where he needed to go or something like that, right?
He was trying to land near the Duke of Hamilton, where supposedly he was going to make some kind of arrangements, and possibly some English intelligence people had lured Hess into thinking that he would be met and received positively by the British government.
Okay, so we're pretty sure, historical fact, that Hess thought he was going to talk about a treaty.
Absolutely. He had documents, he had papers with him. And he made the flight, and he made the flight successfully.
Now the reason you're calling your fictional version of this Churchill's Gambit is because you're speculating on why this happened. And essentially, I think you're saying, and you can explain this, that Churchill set it up to look like he was negotiating with Hess in order to mess with the Russians. He wanted to get in Stalin's head, basically, right?
Churchill was desperate for an ally.
Yeah.
The United States wasn't about to declare war on Germany at this time. We were almost a whole year away from it. So with the book, and a fictional historical book takes definite facts of history and then combines them with some possibilities. So perhaps you can speculate, and there's reason to draw evidence that it took place. Churchill, in order to break Russia away from Germany and retain them for an ally for themselves, involved this complicated plot, which is described in the novel, with Hitler drawing Hess into the web of Churchill's.
Or with Hess, not so much with Hitler, right? 'Cause
Well,
I'm sure
Hess
Hitler
would have been the go-between.
Yeah.
Hess was the go-between who carried it out. He was the number 2 Nazi. He did successfully do it, and what the reasons were are still up for speculation.
Hess then is taken captive in England, I assume, right?
He was arrested immediately. He was treated well. He was placed in several prison camps, including the Tower of London, which is rather ironic, since the Tower of London had often held various royalty and prisoners of war. But Hess was placed there. Whether or not Churchill actually met Hess and personally talked to him has never been declared, though it's often been rumored that he would. And it sounds like something Winston Churchill would do, meet with this guy, talk to him secretly, and then dispose of him. And he was kept in prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah, well, Churchill was very sly
Yes, he
about
was.
his
And
dealings.
he had a lot of grand plans anyway. Many of them were put under the rug and forgotten about.
Yeah.
But some were carried out, and some, actually made some sense.
Is it true that that once they'd broken the Russian code, he knew when ships were going to get sunk, and
The Enigma
and
code
refused
had
to-
been broken. That's exactly
and he
right.
refused to warn the captains of the ships and let them get sunk because he didn't want the Germans to know that he had the code? Is that true?
That's the problem with breaking a code. You can only use so much information. If you use it all, you tip your hand, and then the opponent, the enemy, will
defending
change.
him.
So therefore, you have no choice. And there are instances, it is true, where an action was allowed to happen, where people suffered and died because they did not want the Germans to find out that the Enigma code had been broken.
Well, I would suppose you would argue in the long run that it saved more lives than
Absolutely
than were lost.
And it's a tragic way of looking at reality, but I'm afraid it's the way that war operates. And this was a wartime condition. Remember, the Brits were up against it here.
Oh, yeah.
They were standing alone against Germany, and any possible way to gain an ally, especially one as strong as Russia or the United States, would have been thought of and perhaps attempted.
Well, so have you speculated on really what would have happened had they actually made a truce at that point, or even though it's somewhat inconceivable? How does history play out?
Well, it certainly would have affected Russia. Had Hess convinced Churchill, as far as speculation, to align themselves, but then it would have freed up the Western Front for Germany. Hitler would have been free to invade Soviet Russia, which they did anyway, but they no longer would have had to have worried about fighting England. And of course, Stalin recognized all this. Stalin knew that Hess had flown over there, and Stalin accused Churchill of exactly the things we're talking about.
Yeah, so Stalin believed that this was in fact a plot.
Absolutely. Stalin was convinced.
Yeah. Now, of course, Churchill didn't think any more of Stalin than he did of Hitler. So he wouldn't have been all that disappointed if Germany...
Your enemy's enemy becomes your friend. And politics makes for a very strange bedfellow, as we all know.
Yeah. So who was this Duke of Hamilton who was involved in this?
Well, he was a famous pilot, and he was honored and as a war hero, and he had flown many technically distinguished flights before the war, and he had been to the Olympics to visit the Germans. Many Brits had been in England, either because they admired and respected Hitler and his Nazis, or just out of pure politics or sports. So this Hamilton had visited many of these higher-ranking Nazis at the Olympics, and he had been given an award by the Germans for his great achievements in flight from before the war. So there was kind of a relationship here. Hess claimed that he had met Hamilton at the Olympics. Hamilton said that he could not recall this at all.
But Hamilton was involved in this, or hypothetically
He was totally
involved?
innocent. Oh,
He was, okay.
If the plotting of my book were to be true.
So now we're getting to the book. Okay.
If the plotting were to be true, then they would have used Hamilton and this alliance as a lure to draw Hess over to England to fulfill the rest of these complicated events, which of course makes it Churchill's Gambit to get the Russians on their side and achieve an alliance. And it was. It turned the war around. The biggest mistake that Hitler made in the war was to invade Soviet Russia. It doomed him.
Yeah.
Most of the deaths of the German army were incurred fighting the Russians.
Yeah.
I believe it's something like 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
But it does offer a solution as to why Hess would make this flight. And you could see why Hitler would want to open up this flank to the west and no longer have to worry about England if they were to become even if not an ally, then at least no longer an opponent.
Yeah.
If they could make a peace, that would solve this, achieve the same accomplishment.
Yeah. Hitler is portrayed often as not being very rational when he was making some of these big decisions. Does that play into any of this?
Well, he often had to be tamped down because he was full of ideas, and many of these ideas were so extravagant and so wild. But some of them, like these floating dry docks that were floated across the English Channel to provide immediate docks after the D-Day invasion, that was a very good idea. And his work in propping up the British attitude during the war, when things really did look desperate for a while, you can't deny his strengths and his achievements during the war.
And there were, obviously there were people who were sympathetic to Germany before the war started.
And during the war.
And
there
during
was a quasi-Nazi movement that was, well, we had, even here in the United States, there was a big Lindbergh and others. They weren't
Charles
Nazis.
Lindbergh,
They weren't Nazis, but they wanted peace first, and the peace first movement was very strong. We didn't want to repeat World War I. Well, this movement was even larger in England, and these people were sometimes very, not just neutral to Hitler and the Nazis, but also very partisan towards them and favorable in their opinion of them.
Yeah, fascism was a movement, a worldwide movement at the time.
Exactly, and remember, Hitler had been praised by many leaders around the world, including Churchill and David Lloyd George, the former. Yes, they often spoke of achievements made by Germany early in the middle 1930s and early 1930s. But of course, that isn't played up today because people don't want to be associated with anything positive speaking about Hitler and the Nazis. It doesn't look good on your track record.
Well, I've grown up with family who were World War II buffs, and I inherited my uncle's collection of World War II books. It's a library full of them. He read everything.
Well, I hope you pick up a couple of mine.
Well, I'll have to do that. But obviously, as that generation disappears, and as the generation of their children, which I'm part of, right, is aging and disappearing, we're becoming less conscious of what happened during World War II, of the sacrifices that were made, of the threat that we faced. How does that change?
That is a very strong point.
How does that change us?
It's a very good point. It's excellent because World War II was so significant in the way that the world is today. It was such a huge event, and it was fought all over the world, under the water, in the skies. Civilians were heavily involved, as no war had ever involved civilians before. It transformed the world, and really we're living still, we're just coming out of the post-World War II era, though we still see remnants of it in many places and in many events.
So when you say we're living it, we're coming out of it, what sort of changes do you see happening now that differentiate us?
Well, we finally are coming to terms with is Russia a friend or is Russia an enemy? We know that they were an ally during World War II.
Yeah.
They have been praised for their sacrifices, just like the United States sacrificed. But we also know that, as you mentioned earlier, Hitler and Stalin were of the same ilk.
Yeah.
They were very, very similar. And having Stalin on our side meant somebody who could oppose the Germans. Well, now here we are, 70, 80 years later, and we're coming to grips with this regime that was in power during World War II, the Stalinist regime. And Putin, of course, is a son of the former communist government.
Right.
And we see that.
With a KGB background.
With a KGB background, in his invasion of Ukraine, points out his worldview to us.
How, for people that aren't as familiar with World War II, how is that different from Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I hate to use the word popularity, but the acceptance of it. World War II, it was us or them. It had to be fought, and the people who fought it wholeheartedly. And
Yeah.
the other wars, there was a lot of confusion over why the war was being fought, and of course a
Yeah.
lot of rejection of those reasons. Whereas World War II was almost unanimously favored and sponsored by the entire population of the United States.
Yeah, I suppose really mainland United States wasn't threatened in any
We were
way
very
past that
safe.
point, except for maybe the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis and all
In
of that.
World War II, we had the oceans,
But
and
nuclear missiles aside, right?
that changed the whole equation,
Yeah.
didn't it?
Yeah. Well, so what if, was it possible that we could have lost World War II? I mean, is there, I know
There
there
have been books,
make-believe
yes.
scenarios on this, but I mean, as a historian, if this just plays out,
Well, I don't think the Japanese could have beaten us. Once we determined
Yeah.
we were going to go across the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was doomed.
well, and especially after we wiped them out at Midway, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
6 months into the war,
Yeah.
they were all but finished.
Yeah.
But Germany, on the other hand, and of course, the whole strategy of the Allies was Germany first. Most
Yeah.
of the money, most of the supplies, most of the equipment, most of the effort went to defeating Germany first.
Yeah.
And necessarily, they were a huge threat. Remember, they had rockets, they had missiles.
Oh, yeah,
the
right.
V2.
Yeah,
Had they had an atomic weapon,
Which they would worked on,
which
right?
they
Yeah.
were working on. Had they had an atomic
And
weapon
jets.
to place on one of those rockets of theirs,
Yeah.
it could have caused more than just severe mayhem the way ordinary bombing did of civilian cities.
Could have forced a surrender. Yeah.
Right. The turning point was Germany invading Russia. That swung the balance of power towards the Allies.
There's an interesting parallel, though. I don't know if this has been pointed out, but the United States gets sidetracked fighting Japan, right? And Germany gets sidetracked fighting Russia, right? We wipe out the Japanese threat basically within 6 months, right? Germany gets bogged down at Stalingrad, right?
That's exactly right.
And had it been the other way around, had they been successful and gotten through to Moscow, and had we dragged out the war in the Pacific, right? That certainly throws things in another direction, doesn't it?
It certainly is a plausible speculation.
Yeah.
The power of Russia was in her numbers
Yeah.
and her willingness to let those numbers die. She paid in blood. The United States paid in dollars. Not that Americans didn't suffer and were killed tragically, and we can never forget that. I'm not trying to belittle that.
No, I know. Well, especially
whatsoever.
the D-Day landing, which I know you've written a couple books about that, right?
You only have to visit the place to see just what those gentlemen had to endure at Omaha and Utah Beach and the other 3 beaches of the Allies.
Yeah. So going back to Churchill for a minute, okay? He was sort of spoiling for a fight with the Germans before anything happened, right? I mean, he was very...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He wanted to stand up to them all during the late 1930s. He said, you can't make
Yeah.
peace with them. They're going to keep biting off.
Yeah.
They're going to keep taking one chunk of Europe after another. And they did.
But nobody was paying attention to him initially, right? He was kind
They
of
thought he was a nut.
He was kind of a gadfly nut, and I think he had somewhat of a bad reputation because wasn't there an earlier war that broke out, and he was kind of
well, he fought in World War I.
Yeah.
And one of his stratagems, the Gallipoli invasion in Turkey, turned out to be a disaster.
Yeah.
And he took the heat for that. He resigned from his government position. He actually fought in the trenches for 6 months as a commander. He could have been killed, but he was called back to government. And eventually, he spends what he called his winter years trying to regain high position in the British government, and that finally came around when he was chosen as prime minister at the turning point of World War II.
So the war breaks out, and it's like, oh wow, this guy was right? And
he turned out to be right. All of his predictions turned out.
But then what amazes me, as soon as the war is over, they get rid of him, right?
Well, that's because they were looking at domestic issues, and their population votes, and people voted for Clement Attlee, the next prime minister, who had a very progressive and very modern type of government in mind for taking care of the population, and people bought into it.
But you take Churchill out of the equation, does England hold up? I mean,
That's a good question.
I'm a professor of rhetoric, and so I'm very familiar with his speeches, but it'd be hard to go back through history and find a leader that was more influential.
And then rejected, too.
And
well, whether or not it was on Churchill's shoulders to save England, he felt that it was.
Yes,
desperately.
he did.
And
somebody said once he went around looking his whole life for moments to give those speeches, right?
He believed that he could win the day. And you only have to listen to his speeches, and they are stirring. They're quite inspiring. And he kept England together. Remember, he kept them in the war. And the book, Churchill's Gambit, talks about Franklin Roosevelt. And I propose that Roosevelt knew about this also. And perhaps he did.
He could have,
because Roosevelt wanted a third term. No president had ever had achieved a third term. And he wanted to keep England in the war because he knew that eventually the United States would be fighting Germany, and we had to have a base. And England was the perfect base for that operation.
This is just so much more interesting than what's commonly understood here, right? I mean, Pearl Harbor gets bombed. Churchill, Roosevelt declares war, right? Germany's bombing England.
It all played into Roosevelt's hands. Sounds like the subject of another book.
Yeah, and now we're finding out this is a chess game going on with Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill. It's really interesting stuff.
Well, Roosevelt was determined at all costs. And in this novel of mine, I have him meeting with his #1 aide, Harry Hopkins, and fictional characters who I've created. And Roosevelt's emphasis is, we've got to keep England in the war. We're going to use England as a gigantic aircraft carrier for all of our planes, our bombers, our soldiers. And that's what it became, a supply depot where we could make the D-Day invasion. If you don't have England, it's almost impossible to have a D-Day invasion in Normandy. You've got to have the base. So Roosevelt was already looking forward, was looking ahead, that you've got to preserve England and keep them in the war. So he would have been happy to be involved and accept this Mad Hatter scheme of getting Hess over to Great Britain.
Well, and another interesting chess point that you're making here is there's no D-Day without England. I mean, so what would have happened had England folded? I mean, let's say Germany overruns Western
Well, there
Europe.
might have been a truce. As you mentioned earlier, Stalingrad, had the Germans not been defeated at Stalingrad, or had they taken Moscow earlier, perhaps there would have been a truce.
So there was no backup plan
There was no automatic. It wasn't a done deal automatically that the Allies were going to win. Things were up in the air. Things were up for grabs. But we cannot underestimate the power of Hitler's Nazi war machine. The Wehrmacht was tremendously powerful, and we were very fortunate to keep England in the war. And of course to have them there for the Normandy invasions.
So most people today, their understanding of all of this is based on movies and television and things. As a historian, what are the films that you think, as our last thing to discuss here, what are the films that you think really represent this fairly accurately?
Well, mentioning D-Day, you can't overlook the Saving Private Ryan film. I would think the first 45 minutes to an hour where they actually depict the landing. It couldn't have been more realistically done. It's an excellent film, and it talks about the the effort that was made by these soldiers landing at Omaha Beach. Our other beach, Utah, was taken fairly easily.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I noticed that in the notes today that.
And the other three beaches, Canada had
Yeah.
one, and the Brits had a couple of beaches. They were also taken more. Not that I would have wanted to be.
Not
I'll
easy.
be there.
Not
I mean,
easy,
if there's a
but-
bullet going by your
Yeah,
head,
yeah.
nothing's easy.
With less sacrifice.
But Omaha was rough. Omar Bradley, the American general, almost pulled the Americans off the beach. But the guys dug in. They fought their way up the bluffs. And as I say, if you've been to Normandy, these bluffs, as high as they are, and the position of these soldiers landing in these landing craft, they were very exposed. And Saving Private Ryan does demonstrate that very, very, very well. Extremely well-made movie.
Yeah.
But to get back to your other point, yes,
Yeah.
I'm afraid some people have forgotten just what was involved in World War II,
Yeah.
how epic of a struggle it was, and how important it is still to us to this day.
Very good. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Robert Parker for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.